bass without fear, using the rule of the octave and Handel's lessons to help keyboard harmony actually make sense. This title is referring to my own experience in learning figured bass, because my first couple of exposures to figured bass playing in college did not make a lot of sense to me. I took a keyboard harmony class during my undergraduate degree, and I scraped through the figured bass section, but nothing really stuck from what we did in that class. Later in my master's degree, I did a score reading class, and overall that was an exceptional class, but again, the section on figured bass still felt cryptic to me. I acknowledged that it was an important skill, but it seemed to me that if only I knew the names of the chords, everything would be much simpler. Then later during my master's degree, I took a Baroque counterpoint class with a really exceptional teacher named Karim Alzand. And Professor Alzand included as part of his class some exercises by Handel, which he demonstrated at the piano in one of our classes. I looked over at the score he was playing from. I could see that the score he was playing from had only one line of music in tenor clef, and yet he was playing a complete fugue with multiple voices. And this was baffling to me and fascinating. How in the world did he know what to play? He explained that the way the subject entries had to be filled in was indicated by Handel, but it was up to the performer to fill it in. And the figures explained what harmonies he had to play. But he had a lot of options for how to do those harmonies and how to voice those. Later in the class, he told us about a summer music course called MTAC, which he encouraged us to attend, which was in Basel, Switzerland, if we were interested in learning more about how to play these types of fugues that are only written on one line. I did end up going to Basel for MTAC in 2019. It was a 10-day course in Partimento realization, classical improvisation, and historically informed composition training. The organizer of that program was an exceptional teacher named Tobias Kram, and he showed us lots of treatises by Italian teachers from the 18th and 19th centuries on how to realize bass lines and even how to more creatively use those bass lines to create compositions and even to play fugues. It was at this point, after going to MTAC in Basel, that the concept of figured bass finally began to make sense to me. And I hope that some of these ideas will help it make even more sense to you as well. What I want to do in this presentation is explain what figured bass is, explain how the Italian harmony teachers in the 18th and 19th centuries actually taught it in a somewhat different way from the way normally figured bass is taught today, and how they taught this way in order to arrive at a more fluent understanding of harmony. And then I want to introduce you to what I consider to be one of the most clever music theory hacks ever devised, called the rule of the octave. I'll teach you the version of the rule of the octave used by a counterpoint teacher named Giovanni Furno. Giovanni Furno taught Vincenzo Bellini in the Naples Conservatory. The rule of the octave was actually used by many different Italian teachers for hundreds of years, but I'll just show you the Furno version of it, but it can be found in multiple sources. After that, I want to show you a couple of other bass patterns quickly, which were called moti del basso, bass motions. And these patterns are the basis of reaching a fluent understanding of figured bass. These patterns are found both in the Italian treatises and also in Handel's figured bass exercises. Finally, I will attempt to show you a realization of a partimental fugue by Handel, which uses figured bass to create a fugal composition from a single line of music. All right. Let's discuss what figured bass is. So figured bass is a system of indicating harmonies to be played above a given bass line using numerals and accidentals to indicate intervals above the bass. This system has been around since the very beginning of the Baroque era, and it was actually devised as a way to make it easier for a chordal instrument to accompany other instruments. Without the figures, an accompanist at the organ, for example, would have to read every other part and then figure out what type of chord to play. But if they could write a figure underneath, sorry, am I standing? Thank you, please let me know if I'm messing something up. But if they put a figure underneath the bass line, then that could more quickly indicate to the accompanist exactly what type of chord they were supposed to play. So then the accompanist would simply read the lowest part, and then they would follow the figures to know what notes they needed to add on top of that. Later on in the Baroque era, however, this system became not just a tool for accompaniment, but it became a way of teaching the fundamentals of composition. J.S. Bach is known to have begun his composition lessons with figured bass, and Handel did the same. In Italy, there developed a pedagogical tradition of teaching figured bass in a unique way, which used to not be well understood today, but has been explored by musicologists more in the last 20 years. Go to the next slide here. Teachers like Fedele Fenaroli, Francesco Durante, Giacomo and Sanguine, Giovanni Furno, and others, they left collections of what are known as partimenti, along with rules for realizing the partimenti. A partimento is essentially a figured bass line on one staff, and they were used to teach keyboard harmony. Yet the rules that they used to teach them are what is interesting and what I want to talk to you about today. Rather than focusing on how to play particular figures like a 5/3 chord or a 6/3 chord or a 7/4/2 chord, instead they taught students to look for bass patterns. If you could identify the correct pattern from the bass line you were playing, then you would know what type of chord to use. At this point, figures would actually be redundant because you had identified the correct pattern to use. So Giovanni Furno's book is called An Easy, Brief, and Clear Method Concerning the Primary and Essential Rules for Accompanying Unfigured Partimenti. In other words, here's how you play chords over a bass line when there are no figures. And as I mentioned, Furno taught at the Naples Conservatory in the 19th century, but he was a part of a longer tradition of using the rule of the octave, using moti del basso to teach keyboard harmony. There are many patterns that Furno introduces in his method, but the most basic one and the most important is known as the rule of the octave. As I said, I consider the rule of the octave to be one of the most insightful music theory hacks ever conceived, because the amount of music it enables you to predict is very large. So, the way the rule of the octave works is you have a chord that matches each scale degree of a major scale. There is a version of the rule of the octave that goes up, and there's also a rule of the octave that goes down. They are slightly different from each other. There's also a minor version. I just want to focus on the major version of the rule of the octave today. And the rule of the octave sounds like this. And then the rule of the octave descending sounds like this. So each scale degree has a chord that goes with it. So scale degree 1 in the rule of the octave, scale degree 1 in your bass is going to go with what in figured bass would be called a 5/3 chord, a chord that has a fifth above the bass and a third above the bass. An eighth above the bass is pretty much always assumed to also be valid. So if you have a C in your bass, almost every time you can put another C above it. Okay, scale degree 2, it's a 6/4/3 chord. So a chord with a sixth above, a fourth above, and a third above. There's the sixth, the fourth, and the third. Scale degree 3 gets a 6/3 chord. So it has a sixth above, that's the C, and a third, that's the G, and then you can double the octave. Scale degree 4 is the first one that has a choice. Scale degree 4 is different depending on whether you're using the ascending ascending rule of the octave, or whether you're using the descending rule of the octave. There's scale degree 4, but the type of chord is different if we're going down. Okay, so scale
Why?
degree. Yes.
Why?
Why?
Yeah.
Because the pattern is always contextual. So this is one of the main differences between something like the rule of the octave and simply naming a chord, is that if you just name a chord, it doesn't tell you that much about what happens after. But in the rule of the octave, you have to identify the scale degree, but you also have to identify, is the following note in the bass going to be going down, or is it going up?
Got it.
Good question.
Yeah. Forgive my ineptitude, but what could you spell that chord exactly?
Yes.
Your training fails me.
Yes. So the ascending version, that is it's a 6/5 chord. So you have the sixth, which is D. That's just F again. A is a third,
Right.
and then C is a fifth. So that's the going up version. And then the going down version, this one is a 6/4/2 chord. So we have a B and a G and a D, rather than. Scale degree 5 is stable. Scale degree 5 is the other scale degree that also has a 5/3 chord that goes with it. So the dominant chord. That's just what we would call G major. also a 6-3 chord, so we have an F, A, C. Scale degree 7 is 6-5, so there's an F and a G, leading back to scale degree 1. The descending version has one little twist on scale degree 6. Introduces an F sharp over the A. We talked about that scale degree 4 going down. 3 is the same either way. 2 is the same either way. 1 is the same either way. Any other questions about the rule of the octave so far? Okay. The thing I was most struck by when I first played through the rule of the octave for the first time was how beautiful it was. I've had many students and parents say the same thing to me when they hear it as well. And that's interesting that a music theory exercise could also sound nice. I think that the reason for that is something we'll get into as we go here. So one of the main differences between the rule of the octave and the way, both the way that figured bass is normally explained and also just the way that we teach chords and harmony in general. There's a lot of differences. One of the things I like about the rule of the octave is that it shows that that we actually tend to have what I would call a root position bias. A root position bias is we think that every chord, the default condition of that chord is that it's going to be in root position, and then if you do something else to it, that's like a deviation from the root position. But in reality, the scale degree of your bass, there's some scale degrees, it's very unlikely that you would have a 5-3 chord, or what we would call a root position chord, that would go with that scale degree. Really only scale degree 1 and scale degree 5, all things considered, are the most likely to have that. The other ones will tend to have what we would call inversions, but in this way of thinking, rule of the octave way of thinking, those aren't inversions at all. They're actually the default choice for those bass notes. Now, if the only thing you knew about how to play figured bass was the rule of the octave, I think you would be able to get through a fair amount of music. It certainly doesn't cover all situations. There are many other patterns of bass lines that come up where you would need to break these rules of the rule of the octave. But it would cover a lot. What I want to talk about now is that the rule of the octave, in addition to being useful for realizing bass lines, is also a very useful analytical tool for understanding the chord choices in a piece, in repertoire. I have 3 examples I want to discuss. 2 of them are from Beethoven, and 1 of them is from Brahms. And all 3 of these examples show that if you were just looking at the bass line alone, and you were just looking at what scale degree is that bass note, what key are we in, should we use ascending rule of the octave or descending rule of the octave, depending on what comes next, you would get pretty good guesses about the chord structure if all you used was rule of the octave. So it's figure 3 on the handout. Is this example from Beethoven's Piano Sonata, Opus 2, number 3. It's the second movement, the first 4 bars of that movement. So in this passage, on the bottom, I've labeled what is the scale degree of the bass note. And then on the top, I've labeled what type of chord in figured bass terms is each harmony. So the first chord is a 5-3 chord, which if we were looking at our bass note, we would see that it's an E, which is scale degree 1 in this key, and we would expect that it would be a 5-3 chord. Okay, this chord, scale degree 4. Now again, we have this question, are we going to use the up version of the rule of the octave or the down version? So if we look at the note after the A, we see that it's a G sharp, so we're going down. So we should use the down version of the rule of the octave, and it matches. It's a 6-4-2. It's a 6-4-2 chord, just like the rule of the octave would predict. And then we have scale degree 3 is in the bass. That's a 6-3 chord, again like the rule of the octave. Scale degree 2 in the bass. It's a 6-4-3 chord, rule of the octave. Scale degree 3, 6-3. Scale degree 7. This is a slight, very small difference. The rule of the octave would say there should be an A in there. It's a very slight difference. But 6-3, quite close. And then scale degree 1 back to 5-3. Scale degree 4. Again, this is going to be the up version of scale degree 4. And so we have a 6-3 chord. The version of the rule of the octave I have here would say that it should be 6-5. 6-3 is pretty close to 6-5. It's the difference between this and that. Whether there's an E in it or not, it's quite close. And so on. So that matches pretty well. With the rule of the octave.
I have another dumb question,
Yes,
and mind you, I'm not a pianist.
please.
Okay, so in the third bar, when you have the 3 going to the 7 to the 1,
Yes.
so the 7 to the 1 is ascending, but you're using the descending rule.
Okay, so yes, I see. So you're talking about this part right here, the
Yeah.
third bar.
Yeah,
It goes
going from the
3, 7, 1 on
Yeah.
the left hand.
So that is ascending,
Yes.
but
Great question. Great question. So basically, it has to do with there are slightly different versions of the way the rule of the octave is taught, and the rule of the octave is a generalization. It's in most of the situations, it will probably be this type of
okay.
way of thinking. But what I would say is that one of the main figured bass, or one of the main differences between chords is whether you have a 5th above it, above the bass, or a 6th. Those are two very different types of chords. And if you can get that right, if you can get whether it's gonna be a fifth or a sixth above your bass note, that solves most of the problems. So in that measure, over scale degree 7, the important thing is that we're predicting, okay, that's going to be something with a sixth above it. It's going to have a B and an F sharp. And then whether or not we add A is relatively small compared to that main decision.
Got it.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? Okay, second example on the next page here, figure 4. This is from the Pathétique Sonata, also the second movement. Okay, so on this one, I did not label the scale degrees of the bass, but we are in A flat major, and it's a little small, but I did label the types of chords in between. So the things that I circled on there are things that I would consider to be things you probably wouldn't have predicted just using the rule of the octave by itself. So in measure 3, there's a chord on just rule of the octave, probably wouldn't have guessed that that would be that F minor chord. And then also in measure 6, when we have the F dominant 7 to B flat minor. Also not predicted by the rule of the octave. But the rest of the harmonies do fit. So again, if you just looked at the bass line, just looked at the scale degree of the bass note, you would know what type of chord is being used. And even in measure 3, that what we would call B flat dominant 7th chord is also predicted in the rule of the octave. That's scale degree 6 going down. My last example is from Brahms. This one, in order to make it work, you will have to do some modulating. So there's 2 modulations that happen in this opening. It starts in A major, but then it moves to B minor. So you'll have to keep that in mind as you're applying the rule of the octave, and then it changes to G major. But if you make those modulations, pretty much all of the harmonies fit right into the rule of the octave again. Now we modulate. We're in B minor now. Sorry. Switch to G major. This is scale degree 6 in G major. Okay, so with those modulations in place, rule the octave fits quite well. I want to mention now just a couple other moti del basso or bass patterns that were taught in the Italian conservatories, just to give you an idea of some of the other patterns that were used to help students identify what chords they should use. These patterns do also appear in Handel's continuo playing book. So even though Handel doesn't call them moti del basso, they are presented as sequences, and they're presented as sequences that certain types of chords are going to be used in. So it's similar to the Italian way of looking at figured bass. And again, the main difference between this and simply naming a chord is that this gives you a context. If you have a context and a pattern, then it enables you to predict what should come next or what is likely to come next. One other more narrow bass motion pattern that is in Furno and also in Handel and in other treatises is what they would call down a third, up a second. So if you see your bass line moving down a third and then up a second, and then it does it again and a few times, then think no more. Just plug this pattern in and it will probably work. So your bass line by itself you can just plug in this formula. And that is one way to get the job done if you have that bass pattern. And again, this is quite different and in some ways easier than identifying, okay, this is F major 7 in first inversion, this is B diminished, this is E minor 7 in first inversion, A minor, D minor 7 in first inversion, G. The issue with naming things always by the root is that sometimes the root is not the most important note. The Italian teachers would say that the bass note is the most important note, not the root. One other moti del basso here. And I remember having this question in class, in my score reading class, as we were learning about 6/4-2 chords. And I remember thinking, but when do we use 6/4-2 chords? I know what it is, but I don't know when to play it. And if I had recognized that the correct place to use a 6/4-2 chord is when you have a tied bass, when you have a note in your bass that is extended, that is the time to use a 6/4-2 chord. So even though this pattern is relatively common in music from the 18th and 19th centuries, if we were only thinking in a root and quality way of thinking, we're just not used to thinking of seventh chords in third inversion as being a normal chord, but they are actually. In this context, they are. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is the Handel figured bass lessons. Handel said, nothing could induce me to go back to teaching if it were not for just this genius princess that he taught, Princess Anne, who was one of George II's daughters. And so he made a figured bass manual for her, and it outlines, the first part is all how to play figured bass, but then at the end there's a very interesting section where he introduces the idea of partimento fugue. And as I mentioned before, partimento fugue is where you have just one line of music, but the performer is creating a whole fugue from that one line. And Handel gives a lot of hints about how to make that actually work. If you look at, here we go. If you look at figure 8 on the handout, it's a little small, but you can see under the notation there are letters, like at the very beginning it has a T, and that T is saying the tenor voice has the subject, which is the voice that's written at the beginning. And then in the second measure, it has on beat 3 an A. That's saying, okay, the alto voice now needs to come in with the subject. But what note do we play that subject on? We play it on F, and it's quite hard to see, it's small, but the F has one apostrophe next to it, which means the F above middle C. So your alto voice, enter with the subject on F above middle C, while you still play this stuff that's written on the staff. Okay, and then in measure 4, there is an S underneath, and then that means soprano voice. And there's a C with 2 primes, that means the C 1 octave above middle C. So bring in another subject in the soprano on the C above middle C in measure 4. So you've got these entries of subjects and answers interspersed throughout. And then there are also figures for what types of chords you should play. There are other collections of partimento fugues. There's something called the Langlois manuscript, which may have been related to Johann Sebastian Bach, we're not sure, but somehow in his circle of students and people who worked with him, this manuscript has a really large number. I'm trying to remember, maybe 100 partimento fugues. Fedele Fenaroli's Partimenti in book 5 and book 6, he also has many partimento fugues. Those are edited by Robert Yerdingen, and you can find those on partimenti.org. Partimenti.org has Giovanni Furno's treatise that I'm sharing with you. It has Fenaroli's Partimenti. It has many other authors on there. Very interesting website. Leonardo Leo also has Partimenti, edited by Tobias Cram, also on partimenti.org. Okay, so this Partimento fugue by Handel. So the clef is original. I wouldn't do this to you unless Handel put it in that clef. It is in tenor clef in the original. So we're starting with our subject here. Okay, that's our subject. So starting at the beginning. alto on C. Entrances in there. He's given you the figures for what chords to play, and again, all of the figures on their own can seem kind of overwhelming, but once you can start to see, oh, this is actually a sequence, oh, this is a pattern, this is actually a very likely place for this type of chord to appear, then it becomes much more manageable. Okay, so we talked about the rule of the octave, how the rule of the octave simplifies a lot of harmonic choices by just looking at the scale degree of your bass note, what key you're in, and that will give you an informed guess about what type of chord you could use for that bass note. We talked about how the Italian teachers in the 18th and 19th centuries used this more pattern-based system to teach figured bass and to teach keyboard harmony by identifying sequences and patterns in the bass lines. And finally, we talked about Handel's Partimento fugues, where Handel is showing that figured bass is not just something that you use to accompany other instruments or just a music theory exercise, but it is really something that could lead to more developed composition and even into fugues for understanding how fugues are put together. So I hope that you found this helpful. I know I found it very interesting when I finally understood that there were patterns in the music. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them now. Yeah.
Kind of simplistic, but was the change of clef just simply because the greater number of notes on the staff would lie there more conveniently?
That is a great question. So the clef change, all the clef changes are original, and
so that the notes lie more pleasantly on the staff.
yeah, I think the reason for the clef change is that it starts with a tenor voice, so it was more customary to whatever voice you had to use that clef because it would fit on the staff. You wouldn't have to use ledger lines. And then it changes in the second line to bass because that's when the bass voice enters, and therefore the bass is now going to be the lowest part for the rest of the example, at least on this one. So at that point, it just stays in bass clef. Some other Partimento fugues will change clefs more. They'll write the entrances in and they'll use changes of clefs to indicate that, but not in this one. Any other questions?
Well,
Yes.
just sort of curious, once you get to doing this type of figured bass, in a fugue, most of the options of the performer, the creativity, is by and large eliminated, is it not, by what they're required to do?
Yes, I would say that your choices here have to do with voicing what position you play the chords in to some extent, and any additional figuration you might try to sneak in. Not all of the Partimento fugues are this strict, so the Langlois manuscript does not indicate when subjects come in. You actually have to figure that out yourself. So it's a little bit more of a puzzle for the performer. In Handel's exercises, he gives you more clues to help.
This rule of the octave in your presentation, are there any hints on how to the ornamentation, how we can apply this to ornamentation?
Yeah, it's a great question. I have thought about this question actually because it is quite plain in itself, and I think that, for example, if you look at some of the other collections, like Fenaroli's collection, his bass lines are more elaborate. They're not just note to note, but his bass lines have a lot of stylistic character to them, and I think that that also invites you, when you are realizing them, to realize them in a way that matches the character of the bass line that's there. I don't know if that answers your question.
It helps a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. And these were used to teach keyboard harmony, so there were other subjects, of course, that they would have learned, counterpoint, and it's very possible that they realized these in very different ways, depending on, you know, there's more than one way to play the rule of the octave.
The book on continual playing for Princess Anne,
Yeah.
is that something you would recommend? Is it accessible? Is it available? Is it accessible and you recommend it?
It is accessible. Yeah, the editor is David Ledbetter, and I've looked at several figured bass books. I think, in my opinion, this was the one that I found to make the most sense. But again, the method by Giovanni Furno is not in print, but you can find it on partimenti.org, and it is free, and you can look at the PDF of that and see how he was teaching, and he goes much more into these patterns of bass motion that I think are also essential for really understanding how these bass lines work. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you so much. I hope it was helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. We're so lucky to have you as part of our branch. And
Yes.
my head's a little on fire right now, and I'm really glad I played but I learned a lot.
Gotta go home and try this.